Bohemond began spreading word that he was considering leaving the Crusader army. He claimed he could no longer neglect his responsibilities back home. Up to that point, he had played a leading role in the Crusades' military efforts, and he believed that the threat of losing his support at such a crucial moment would alarm the army. He hinted that if he were granted control over Antioch, it would make up for whatever losses he might face from being away from Italy. While the other princes saw through his tactics, he gained considerable sympathy from the common soldiers. Meanwhile, the Turks were regrouping to relieve the Siege of Antioch. After Dukhak failed to provide the promised assistance, Yaghisian turned once more to his former overlord Ridwan of Aleppo. Ridwan now regretted his earlier inaction that had allowed the Crusaders to reach Antioch. When Yaghisian accepted his authority again, Ridwan agreed to help. Supported by his cousin Sokman, the Ortakid from Dorbekir, and his father-in-law, the Emir of Hama. In early February, their combined forces retook Harran and began preparing for an assault on the Crusader camp. When news of this reached the Crusaders, their leaders met in Adamar's tent. Their Bohemond suggested that the infantry stay in the camp to defend against any attacks from the city, while the knights, only 700 of whom were still battle-ready, would launch a surprise attack on the approaching Turkish forces. His plan was approved. On the evening of February 8th, the Frankish cavalry crossed the pontoon bridge and positioned themselves between the river and Lake Antioch, ready to strike the Turks as they attempted to cross the iron bridge. At dawn, the Turkish army appeared, and the Crusaders launched an immediate charge before the Turkish archers could organize. Though the initial charge didn't break the Turkish formation, the knights pulled back strategically, drawing the enemy into a narrow area where the lake and river restricted their movement. There, the knights launched a full-force assault. Overwhelmed by the heavy cavalry, the lightly armed Turks broke ranks and fled, causing chaos among their own forces. Ridwan's entire army soon fell into disarray and retreated toward Aleppo. As they fled through Harran, its garrison joined them, abandoning the town, which the local Christians then returned to the Crusaders. While the cavalry were achieving this stunning victory, the infantry had a tougher fight. Yaghisian launched a major assault on the Crusader camp. The defenders began to falter, but in the afternoon, the returning victorious knights were seen approaching. Realizing the relief army had been defeated, Yaghisian ordered his forces to retreat back inside the city walls. Although the defeat of the Second Relief Army boosted the Crusaders' morale, it did little to improve their immediate circumstances. Food remained scarce, even though supplies had started arriving at the port of St. Simeon, mostly from Cyprus. There, the Patriarch Simeon, along with the often overlooked Tatisius, had gathered all available provisions. However, the route from the port to the camp was constantly threatened by raiding parties from the city, who ambushed the smaller convoys. Meanwhile, Antioch itself continued receiving supplies through the still unguarded Gate of St. George and over the fortified bridge, to secure the bridge and make the road to St. Simeon safer. Raymond proposed building a tower on the north bank nearby, but progress was slow due to a shortage of building materials and skilled laborers. Then, on March 4th, an Englishman fleet arrived at St. Simeon, led by the exiled English prince Edgar Atheling. The fleet brought pilgrims from Italy and had stopped in Constantinople, where Edgar joined and placed himself under the emperor's command. It was there the fleet had been stocked with siege equipment and skilled workers who arrived just when they were most needed. The Crusaders, however, made no mention of the emperor's contribution. Upon hearing of the fleet's arrival, Raymond and Bohemond decided to go together, neither trusting the other to go alone to recruit as many fighters as possible and escort the craftsmen and supplies back to the main camp. On March 6th, while returning along the road from St. Simeon with their loads, they were ambushed by a unit from the city's garrison. Taken by surprise, their troops panicked and fled, abandoning their valuable cargo to the enemy. Some stragglers reached the camp and spread the rumor that both Raymond and Bohemond had been killed. Reacting to the news, Godfrey prepared to lead a rescue mission. At that moment, the Turks launched a sudden attack from the city on the Crusader camp, hoping to distract them and give their ambushing force, now burdened with loot, a safe path back to the city. But Godfrey's troops, already armed and ready to head toward the port road, held their ground until Raymond and Bohemond suddenly reappeared with the remnants of their forces. Despite being weakened, their arrival gave Godfrey the reinforcements needed to repel the attackers. The Crusader leaders then worked together to cut off the retreat of the ambushers. Their strategy was completely effective. Laden with stolen goods, the Turkish raiders were outmaneuvered and slaughtered as they tried to reach the bridge. The valuable building supplies were recovered. Reports claimed that 1,500 Turks were killed, many drowning in the river as they tried to escape. Among the dead were 9 emirs. That night, members of the city garrison crept out to bury their fallen in the Muslim cemetery on the river's north bank. The Crusaders saw them and let them proceed without interference. But the following morning, they returned to the graves, exhuming the bodies in search of gold and silver ornaments worn by the dead. The Crusaders' recent victory allowed them to fully blockade Antioch. With the arrival of workers and building materials, they completed construction of a fortress overlooking the fortified bridge. It was built near a mosque by the Muslim cemetery and officially named the Castle of Lama Hamori, derived from an old French word for mosque. However, when the leaders discussed who should take command of the fortress, Raymond, who had first proposed its construction, insisted on keeping control himself. As a result, it became commonly known as Raymond's Castle. The building was completed by March 19th and quickly proved effective in cutting off access to the bridge gate. However, the Gate of St. George remained open. To bring it under control, the Crusaders decided to build another castle on the site of a former convent on the hill facing the gate. Construction was finished in April, and the new fortress was entrusted to Tancred. It was given 300 marks to cover the costs. From that point on, no supply caravans were able to reach the city, and its residents could no longer send their livestock outside the walls to graze as they had before. While individual raiders could still slip over the walls of Mount Silpius or sneak through the narrow iron gate, organized sorties became impossible. As the city's garrison began to feel the effects of starvation, the Crusaders' own supply situation improved. The arrival of spring brought better weather and safer conditions for foraging as Turkish attacks became less frequent. Meanwhile, merchants who had previously sold their goods at high prices to the city's defenders began doing business with the Crusaders instead, making more food available and boosting the army's morale. Not long after his fortress was completed, Tancred intercepted a large shipment of food intended for Yogisian. The convoy, transported by Syrian and Armenian Christian merchants, was captured and brought back to the Crusader camp. These successes encouraged the Crusaders to believe that Antioch could now be starved into surrender. But they knew they had to act fast. Kerbogha of Mosul, a formidable enemy, was already gathering his army. While the Crusaders were still in Constantinople, Emperor Alexius had advised them to reach some sort of agreement with the Fatimids of Egypt. The Fatimids were bitter enemies of the Turks, generally tolerant of their Christian subjects, and had a history of negotiating with Christian powers. It's likely that the Crusaders did not act on this advice at the time. However, in early spring, an Egyptian delegation arrived at the Crusader camp outside Antioch, sent by Alafdel, the powerful vizier of the young Caliph al-Musta'li. Alafdel's proposal appears to have involved dividing the Seljuk Empire. The Crusaders would control northern Syria, while Egypt would take Palestine. He likely viewed the Crusaders as mercenaries working for the Byzantine emperor and assumed that restoring the pre-Turkish territorial balance would seem reasonable to them. The Western princes welcomed the Egyptian envoys warmly, though they made no firm commitments. The Egyptians remained at the camp for several weeks before returning home, accompanied by a small Frankish delegation and bearing generous gifts, mostly spoils taken in the victory of March 6th. These diplomatic exchanges showed the Crusaders how beneficial it could be to engage in political maneuvering with Muslim powers. Putting aside some of their religious biases, they soon attempted a similar approach when they learned of Kerbogha's military preparations. They sent messengers to Dukak of Damascus, requesting that he remain neutral and assuring him they had no intention of invading his lands. But Dukak, who saw his brother Ridwan of Aleppo as his main rival, and noticed that Ridwan had resumed a neutral stance, refused to accept their offer. By early May, it was clear that Kerbogha was on the move. In addition to his own forces, he had troops supplied by the sultans of Baghdad and Persia, along with warriors from the Ordochid princes of northern Mesopotamia. Dukak was preparing to join him, and despite being under great pressure, Yaghi was still holding out in Antioch. Tension grew among the Crusaders. They understood that if they didn't capture the city before Kerbogha's arrival, they would be trapped between the garrison inside Antioch and the massive relief army approaching from outside. Emperor Alexius was currently engaged in a campaign. In Asia Minor, the Crusaders sent him an urgent plea, begging him to come to their aid quickly. Bohemond, eager to claim Antioch for himself, had particular reason to worry. If the emperor reached the city before it fell, or if Kerbogha was defeated only with the emperor's support, it would be impossible to deny the city's return to Byzantine control, while most of the princes were willing to let Bohemond take. Antioch, Raymond of Toulouse, refused to agree, likely backed by the Bishop of Lepuy. Raymond's motives have been the subject of much debate. He was the only prince who had not sworn a formal oath of allegiance to the emperor, though he had departed Constantinople on good terms. He also deeply distrusted Bohemond, viewing him as his main rival for military leadership of the Crusade. Additionally, both he and the papal legate Adhemar may have believed that if the oath to the emperor was void, only the church through Adhemar had the authority to assign captured lands. Eventually, after political maneuvering and debate, a compromise was reached. If Bohemond's troops were the first to enter the city, and if the emperor never arrived, then he would be allowed to claim Antioch for himself. Even then, Raymond hesitated, but Bohemond was already feeling confident. Kerbogha's own strategic misstep gave the Crusaders valuable time. He was reluctant to advance on Antioch while leaving the Frankish-held city of Edessa on his flank. He failed to understand that Baldwin was too weak to launch any attack, yet secure enough in his fortress to resist any assault. For the last 3 weeks of May, Kerbogha stalled at Edessa, launching unsuccessful attacks on its defenses, before finally deciding that the siege was not worth the delay. During those crucial 3 weeks, Bohemond was actively plotting. At some point, he had established secret contact with a captain inside Antioch named Firouz. Firouz was likely an Armenian, who had converted to Islam and had risen to a high-ranking position in Yogisian's administration, though he appeared. Loyal Firouz harbored resentment toward his master, who had recently punished him for hoarding grain. He maintained discreet connections with fellow Armenians and, through them, entered into an agreement with Bohemond to betray the city. The plot was kept entirely secret. Bohemond confided in no one. Instead, he publicly stressed the growing danger to the Crusaders in order to make his eventual success seem all the more impressive. His strategy worked too well. By the end of May, Kerbogha gave up his futile siege of Edessa and resumed his march toward Antioch. As his army approached, panic began to spread throughout the Crusader camp. Desertions increased so rapidly that stopping them was impossible. On June 2nd, a large group of northern French knights, led by Stephen of Blois, fled toward Alexandretta, only 2 months earlier. Stephen had written confidently to his wife, describing the hardships of the siege, but also celebrating the victory. On March 6th, and highlighting his own role in the campaign, now, with the city still in enemy hands and Kerbogha's powerful force approaching, he believed staying would mean certain death. Though never known for bravery, he chose to leave hoping he might survive to fight another day. Stephen had been the most outspoken admirer of the emperor among the Crusader leaders. Bohemond likely watched his departure with some satisfaction, aware that this flight would soon work to his advantage in unexpected ways. If Stephen had delayed his escape by just a few hours, he might have changed his mind. On that very day, Firouz sent his son to Bohemond with words that he was ready to carry out the betrayal. Rumors later claimed that Firouz had hesitated until the night before, when he discovered that his wife was involved with one of his Turkish colleagues, pushing him to act Firouz, was in command of the Tower of the Two Sisters and the nearby section of the city wall facing Tancred's fortress. He advised Bohemond to lead the Crusader army eastward that afternoon, pretending to move against Kerbogha. Then, after nightfall, they should double back to the western side of the city, bringing ladders to scale the wall near the tower, where Firouz would be waiting. If Bohemond agreed to the plan, Firouz would send his son back that evening as a hostage to prove his commitment. Bohemond followed Firouz's plan. As the day wore on, he sent one of his infantrymen named Mail Quran around the camp to announce that the army would set out at sunset for a raid into enemy territory. Then he summoned the leading princes, Ezedemir, Raymond, Godfrey, and Robert of Flanders, and, for the first time, revealed his secret plan. Tonight, he told them, if God is with us, Antioch will be ours. If Raymond felt any jealousy, he kept it to himself. He and the others gave their full support. At sunset, the Crusader army began moving east. The cavalry advanced through the valley in front of the city, while the infantry climbed over the hills behind. The Turks inside Antioch saw them depart and relaxed, expecting a quiet night. But in the middle of the night, the army reversed course. Heading back toward the western and northwestern walls just before dawn, Bohemond's forces arrived at the Tower of the Two Sisters. A ladder was raised against the tower, and 60 knights climbed up one by one, led by Folk of Chartres. They entered through a high window into a room where Firouz waited anxiously. At first he was alarmed by how few of them there were. "We have so few Franks," he cried in Greek. "Where is Bohemond?" But his concern was short-lived. From the Two Sisters, the knights quickly seized control of the two neighboring towers. This allowed their comrades to scale the wall between them, while an Italian foot soldier rushed to tell Bohemond it was time to enter. As Bohemond climbed up, the ladder broke behind him. Meanwhile, some soldiers ran along the wall, surprising the tower guards, while others dropped down into the city to rally the local Christian population. With their help, they flung open the gate of St. George and the main gate of the bridge, where the rest of the army was waiting. The Crusaders poured into the city, encountering little resistance. Greeks and Armenians joined them in slaughtering every Turk they encountered, men and women, alike including Firouz's own brother. In the chaos, many Christians also lost their lives. Yaghi-Siyan, wakened by the noise, quickly realized the city was lost. He fled horseback with his bodyguards, riding through the gorge toward the Iron Gate and into the hills. But his son, Shamsadollah, remained calm. He gathered what men he could and retreated to the citadel before the Crusaders could reach him. Pursued him but failed to break in. Instead, he planted his purple banner to the highest point he could reach. When the Crusaders saw it waving in the early morning light, it gave them fresh hope and lifted their spirits as they flooded into the city. Once Bohemond had gathered enough troops, he launched a serious assault on the citadel. However, the attack was repelled, and he was wounded in the fighting. His men quickly lost interest in the hard fighting and turned instead to the more rewarding task of looting the city. Bohemond's disappointment was soon eased when an Armenian peasant brought him the head of Yaghi-Siyan. As Yaghi fled along a mountain path, he had been thrown from his horse. His guards abandoned him, and while he lay weak and dazed, some Armenians found and recognized him. But they killed him immediately. One of them earned a generous reward by delivering his severed head to Bohemond, while the others sold his belt and sword sheath for 60 bezant each. By nightfall on June 3rd, there were no Turks left alive in Antioch. Even in nearby villages that the Crusaders hadn't reached, the Turkish population had fled, seeking refuge with Kerbogha. Homes belonging to both Muslim and Christian residents were looted. Weapons, treasures, and valuables were either stolen, scattered, or destroyed without purpose. The streets were littered with rotting bodies, so many that it was impossible to walk without stepping on them in the sweltering summer heat. But despite the horror and destruction, Antioch was once again in Christian hands. The capture of Antioch was a major victory that lifted the spirits of Christians everywhere. But once the excitement faded and the Crusaders assessed their situation, they realized they were not much better off than before. It's true that they have gained some critical advantages. The city's strong fortifications, left undamaged in the battle, now protected them from Kerbogha's approaching army. Their civilian followers, still numerous despite disease and desertion, were now sheltered within the city, no longer a burden on the camp. The Turkish garrison that had once threatened them was nearly wiped out. However, serious problems remained. Defending the city's long walls required more soldiers than the Crusaders had available. The citadel was still in enemy hands and had to be closely watched. While the defenders inside were too weak to launch an attack, they could observe everything happening in the city below, and there was no way to prevent them from establishing communication with Kerbogha's forces. The Crusaders had hoped to find stockpiles of food inside Antioch, but there was little, and in their victory frenzy, they had destroyed much of the city's wealth themselves. And although the Muslim population had been killed, the native Christian population couldn't be fully trusted, especially the Syrians, who had betrayed the Crusaders before and felt little connection to their Latin conquerors. Their disloyalty posed a much greater threat to an occupying army than it would have to an outside force. Worse still, the victory reignited a brewing conflict. Who would control the city? There was no time to argue over Antioch's future just yet. Kerbogha was advancing, and the city needed to be defended immediately. Whatever Bohemond's personal ambitions were, he couldn't man the walls without help from the other leaders. Each prince took responsibility for a section of the fortifications. The army's first priority was to clean up the city and bury the dead quickly, for the decaying corpses caused a deadly outbreak. While the soldiers carried out this grim task, the Bishop of Lepuy oversaw the restoration of the Cathedral of St. Peter and other churches that the Turks had defiled. Christian worship was re-established. The legitimate patriarch John was released from prison and returned to his seat. Though John was a Greek and not fond of Latin customs, he was the rightful head of a church that was still in communion with Rome. Adhemar had no intention of ignoring his legitimacy or offending local sentiment. None of the Crusaders objected to John's reinstatement except perhaps Bohemond, who likely saw it as an obstacle to his own ambitions. The Crusaders had barely secured their position inside Antioch when Kerbogha arrived. On June 5th, he reached the Orontes River at the Iron Bridge, and 2 days later, he camped outside the city on the very ground the Crusaders had recently abandoned. Shams ad-Dawla immediately sent messengers from the citadel to request his support. However, Kerbogha insisted that his own troops take control of the citadel. Shams pleaded to remain in command until the city was retaken, but Kerbogha refused. He was forced to surrender the fortress and all its supplies to Kerbogha's trusted commander, Ahmed ibn Marwan. Kerbogha's initial plan was to break into the city from the citadel. Anticipating this move, Bohemond and Raymond had quickly constructed a makeshift wall to separate the citadel from the rest of the city's defenses. This was the most vulnerable part of their fortifications, and the princes took turns guarding it. After scouting the area, Ahmed ibn Marwan launched an assault on this section. Likely early on June 9th, the defense was led by Hugh of Vermandois, the Count of Flanders, and the Duke of Normandy. Though nearly overwhelmed, they managed to repel the attack with heavy casualties on both sides. Realizing the cost of a direct assault, Kerbogha shifted tactics. He decided to surround the city completely and wait for starvation to weaken the Crusaders. On June 10th, he completed the encirclement. The Crusaders made a fierce attempt to disrupt the blockade with a sortie, but they were quickly driven back behind the walls. The failure left the Crusaders deeply demoralized. The hope and energy they had gained from capturing the city just a week earlier now gave way to despair. Food became desperately scarce. A small loaf of bread cost a bezant, a single egg 2 bezants, and a chicken 15. Many people survived only on tree leaves or dried animal hides. Adhemar of Lepuy tried in vain to organize food relief for the poorest pilgrims. Among the knights, some began to think that Stephen of Blois had made the wisest decision by leaving. On the night of June 10th, a group led by William and Aubrey of Grant-Mesnil, along with Lambert, Count of Clermont, slipped through enemy lines and hurried to the port of St. Simeon. They found Frankish ships in the harbor, likely some Genoese vessels and others from Guynemer's fleet. When the fugitives declared that the crusading army was doomed, the ships quickly set sail for a safer port. The deserters joined them and traveled to Tarsus, where they met up with Stephen of Boyle. Stephen had initially planned to return to Antioch after hearing it had been captured, but he changed his mind after catching sight of Kerbogha's massive army from a distance. William of Grantmesnil was married to Bohemond's sister, Mabila, so his defection coming from someone so closely tied to the Norman leader had a powerful impact on morale within the army. For the Crusaders trapped inside Antioch, it now seemed that their only hope of survival lay in the arrival of the emperor and his army. Word had already reached them that Alexius had departed from Constantinople. Earlier that spring, John Ducas had pushed forward from Lydia into Phrygia, reaching the main route the Crusaders had used and reopening the road to Italia. With this in mind, Alexius believed it was safe to lead his main force deeper into Asia Minor to aid the crusade, though many of his advisors opposed the move. Worried about leading the army far from the capital through territory not yet fully secured, by mid-June, Alexius had reached Philomelium and was preparing to press onward when Stephen and William arrived at his camp. They had sailed from Tarsus together and probably at Italia learned the emperor's location, leaving their men to continue by. See, they'd traveled north to deliver devastating news. The Turks were now in control of Antioch, and the Crusader army had been destroyed. Around the same time, another man, Peter of Alps, also reached the emperor. He had abandoned his post at Comana, east of Caesarea, and reported that a Turkish force was advancing, intending to strike Alexius before he could reach Antioch. Alexius had little reason to doubt any of their accounts. Stephen, after all, had been a trustworthy ally in the past, and the total collapse of the Crusader effort was entirely plausible. Faced with this grim outlook, the emperor reconsidered his plans. If Antioch had fallen and the Crusaders had been wiped out, the Turks would surely press on with their offensive. The Seljuks would attempt to reclaim everything they had lost. Now, backed by the full might of the Turkish world, continuing toward Antioch under such circumstances would be reckless. His left flank was already exposed to attack and stretching. His supply lines any further for what now seemed like a lost cause was out of the question. Even if he had been as bold as the Crusader princes, the risk would hardly have been worth taking. But Alexius wasn't just a military leader. He was the head of a vast and vulnerable empire. His primary duty was to protect his people. He called the council and announced that the army would withdraw. One member of his staff, Guy Bohemond, half-brother and a Norman prince who had long served the emperor, was deeply troubled by the news and pleaded with Alexius to continue the march, hoping the Crusaders might still be saved. But no one else supported the idea. And so, the great Byzantine army turned back, retreating north and leaving behind a wide buffer of scorched land to shield the newly reclaimed territory from Turkish advances. It might have been better for the Byzantine Empire and for the peace of Eastern Christendom if Alexius had heeded Guy's plea to press forward. Even though he would not have arrived at Antioch in time for the decisive battle, when word reached the Crusaders that the imperial army had turned back, their disappointment quickly turned to anger. They saw themselves as the soldiers of Christ fighting against unbelievers. To refuse to come to their aid, no matter how hopeless things seemed, was viewed as a betrayal of faith. They couldn't understand that the emperor had other responsibilities. Instead, his decision only reinforced their existing mistrust and resentment toward the Greeks. The Byzantine Empire was never forgiven for this. Bohemond used bitterness to further his own ambitions. Stephen of Blois was also held responsible. Chroniclers harshly criticized him for what they saw as cowardice, and the story quickly spread throughout Europe. When he returned home at a comfortable pace, he was met by a furious wife who was ashamed of him and who didn't stop pressing him until he agreed to return east and redeem himself. Meanwhile, Kerbogha kept up the pressure on Antioch. On June 12th, a surprise assault nearly gave him control of a tower on the southwest wall. It was saved only by the courage of 3 knights from Malines. To prevent such close calls from happening, again, Bohemond ordered entire city blocks near the walls to be burned down. This created open ground, allowing troops to move and respond more effectively. At this low point, The Crusaders' morale was suddenly lifted by a series of events they saw as signs of divine favor. Though they were hungry and afraid, and their faith had begun to falter, it had not entirely failed them. In this atmosphere of fear and exhaustion, dreams and visions flourished. To people in the Middle Ages, the supernatural wasn't considered unlikely or rare. Modern ideas about the subconscious mind didn't exist. Dreams and visions were thought to come from God or, sometimes, from the devil. Skepticism, when it existed, was aimed more at the dreamer's honesty than at the idea of visions themselves. This mindset must be kept in mind when considering the extraordinary events that followed. On June 10, 1098, a poorly dressed peasant arrived at Count Raymond's tent and insisted on speaking with both the Count and the Bishop of Lpuy. His name was Peter Bartholomew. He had joined the crusade as the servant of a Provençal pilgrim named William Peter. Although of humble origins, Peter was not entirely uneducated. Still, he was known among the soldiers as a rather dubious character, more interested in life's pleasures than in spiritual matters. Peter claimed that over the past few months, he had been tormented by visions. In them, St. Andrew had revealed the location of one of Christianity's most sacred relics, the Holy Lance that had pierced Christ's side. The first vision, he said, came on the night of the earthquake on December 30th, as he prayed in fear. An old man with silver hair appeared, beside a tall, radiant youth. The old man identified himself as St. Andrew and instructed Peter to go at once to the Bishop of Lpuy and Count Raymond. The bishop, the saint said, was to be rebuked for neglecting his duties as a preacher. The Count, on the other hand, was to be shown the hiding place of the lance. Peter described being miraculously transported clad only in his shirt to the city, to the Cathedral of St. Peter, which the Turks were using as a mosque. Entering through the south door into a chapel, St. Andrew disappeared into the ground and returned carrying the lance. When Peter tried to take it, he was told to come back after the city had been captured, bringing 12 companions with him, to search for it in the same place. Then he found himself returning to the camp, but Peter did not obey. He feared no one would take a poor man like him seriously. Instead, he went on a foraging mission to Edessa. On the morning of February 10th, while staying in a castle near Edessa, St. Andrew appeared again this time, reprimanding him for his disobedience. As punishment, Peter temporarily lost his sight. The saint also reminded him that God had placed the Crusaders under his special protection, and that all the saints longed to take up their bodies and fight. Alongside them, Peter admitted his mistake and returned to Antioch. But again, he lacked the courage to speak to the great lords. In March, when his master William Peter traveled to Cyprus to buy food, Peter went with him. On the night before Palm Sunday, March 20th, while they were sleeping, in a tent at St. Simeon, St. Andrew appeared once more. Peter repeated his excuses. The saint reassured him and gave further instructions for Count Raymond to follow when the Crusaders reached the River Jordan. William Peter overheard the conversation but saw nothing himself. Peter then returned to Antioch, but once more failed to gain an audience with Count Raymond. So he set out again toward Mamistra to resume the journey to Cyprus. St. Andrew appeared again, angrily commanding him to go back. Peter tried to comply, but his master insisted they board a boat. 3 times the vessel was blown back to shore before finally landing on an island near St. Simeon, where they gave up the journey. Peter fell ill for a time. By the time he recovered, Antioch had been captured. He entered the city and fought. In the battle on June 10th, narrowly surviving after being crushed between 2 horses, St. Andrew then appeared again, this time so sternly that Peter no longer dared to disobey. He told his story first to his fellow soldiers. Despite widespread skepticism, he now came forward to repeat it to Count Raymond, and the Bishop of Lpuy Adhemar was not impressed. He saw Peter Bartholomew as a questionable and untrustworthy figure. Perhaps he was irritated by the implied criticism of his own commitment as a preacher. Or maybe he recalled having seen another Holy Lance in Constantinople, one whose claim to authenticity was long established. As a seasoned churchman, he was naturally skeptical of visions reported by uneducated men. Raymond, on the other hand, had a simpler and more fervent form of piety, and he was more open to believing. He agreed to attend a solemn search for the lance in 5 days and, in the meantime, placed Peter Bartholomew under the care of his chaplain. Visions, it seemed, were contagious. That same evening, while the princes were gathered in the upper part of the city, near the wall guarding the citadel, a priest from Valence named Stephen approached them, asking to speak. He said that the night before, fearing the Turks had captured the city, he had gone with several other clerics to the Church of Our Lady to hold a prayer service. After the others had fallen asleep, he lay awake and saw before him a figure of extraordinary beauty. The figure asked who the men were, and seemed pleased to learn they were good Christians, not heretics. Then he asked Stephen if he recognized him. Stephen began to say no, but noticed a halo in the shape of a cross around the figure's head, just like in depictions of Christ. The figure then identified himself as Christ and asked who led the Crusader army. Stephen replied that there was no single leader, but that a bishop held the highest authority. Christ then told Stephen to inform the bishop that the people had strayed, indulging in lust and immorality. But if they turned back to a truly Christian way of life, he would send them divine protection within 5 days. A radiant lady then appeared and told Christ that these were the people for whom she had pleaded so often. St. Peter also appeared beside them. Stephen tried to wake one of his companions to witness the vision. But before he could, the figures vanished. Adhemar was willing to accept Stephen's vision as genuine. Stephen was a respected priest, and he swore on the gospel that he was telling the truth. Seeing that the other princes were moved by the story, Adhemar immediately urged them all to swear, in the presence of the Holy Sacrament, that none of them would leave Antioch without the agreement of the rest. Bohemond was the first to take the oath, followed by Raymond, Robert of Normandy, Godfrey, Robert of Flanders, and then the lesser lords. News of the oath spread quickly and lifted the spirits of the army. Stephen's mention of a divine sign, arriving in 5 days, also gave credibility to Peter Bartholomew's claims. Hope and anticipation spread through the camp. On June 14th, meteor was seen falling toward the Turkish camp. Many saw it as a divine omen. The next morning, Peter Bartholomew was taken to the Cathedral of St. Peter, accompanied by a group of 12, including Count Raymond, the Bishop of Orange, and the chronicler Raymond of Aglers. Workmen spent the entire day digging into the cathedral floor, finding nothing. Count Raymond left, disappointed. Then Peter, wearing only a shirt, jumped into the trench himself. Asking everyone to pray, he triumphantly pulled out a piece of iron. Raymond of Aglers claimed he had embraced the object while it was still buried. The story of the discovery spread rapidly, filling the army with joy and renewed energy. It's impossible now to say exactly what happened. The cathedral had recently been cleaned when it was reconsecrated, and Peter may have worked there after returning to Antioch, a date he never clearly gave, giving him a chance to bury the object himself. Or perhaps he had an uncanny ability to sense the presence of metal. Remarkably, even in an age when miracles were widely accepted, Adhemar continued to believe Peter was a fraud. As later events would show, others shared that skepticism, though no one voiced it yet. The discovery of the relic had inspired such hope even among the Greeks and Armenians that no one wanted to spoil the uplifting moment. Peter, however, somewhat shook the confidence of his supporters 2 days later when he claimed to have received another visit from St. Andrew. Possibly feeling envious of Stephen's direct encounter with Christ, Peter was pleased to report that the silent figure who had accompanied Andrew in his own visions was, in fact, Christ himself. The saint also gave Peter detailed instructions for how the discovery should be commemorated both immediately and on future anniversaries. The Bishop of Orange, growing suspicious of the amount of liturgical detail Peter was providing, asked if he could read. Peter, sensing danger, claimed to be illiterate. This was soon exposed as a lie, but his supporters were comforted when he suddenly seemed to lose the ability to read entirely. St. Andrew then appeared again, warning that the Crusaders were running out of time as hunger threatened them. A battle against the Turks must happen soon. He instructed the people to fast for 5 days to atone for their sins, after which the army would be granted victory. He also gave one final order. There was to be no looting of the Turkish camp after the battle, with Count Raymond sick. Bohemond had taken full command of the Crusader forces. He had already decided that their only option was to launch a full-scale attack on Kerbogha's camp. It's possible that St. Andrew's latest message to Peter Bartholomew Jing, such an attack was inspired more by human strategy than divine revelation. As the morale of the Crusaders was rising, Kerbogha was facing growing problems within his own ranks. Ridwan of Aleppo still refused to join the campaign. But Kerbogha now saw a need for his support and began negotiating with him. This move angered Dukhak of Damascus, who was already nervous about Egyptian advances in Palestine and eager to return south. Meanwhile, the Emir of Homs refused to cooperate with the Emir of Manbij due to a family feud. Tensions were also high between the Turks and Arabs in Kerbogha's own. Kerbogha tried to maintain discipline through strict authoritarian rule. But the emirs, who all knew that he was just an Atabug, a regent with no royal blood resented his authority. As June wore on, desertions increased. Many Turks and Arabs left his army and returned home. The Crusader leaders were likely aware of these internal issues and decided to try one last diplomatic approach to convince Kerbogha to abandon the siege. On June 27th, they sent an embassy to his camp, led by Peter the Hermit and a Frank named Herluin, who could speak both Arabic and Persian. That Peter was chosen shows he had regained some standing in the army. Despite the disgrace he suffered after his attempted desertion 5 months earlier, none of the princes went, likely out of concern that their safety wouldn't be guaranteed. So Peter, as the most well-known non-combatant, was considered the best option. His willingness to go showed courage and helped restore his reputation. We don't know exactly what Peter and Herluin offered Kerbogha, since the dramatic speeches later attributed to them by chroniclers were likely invented. Some sources suggest they proposed settling the conflict with a series of single combats. But Kerbogha, despite his army's weakening condition, insisted on unconditional surrender. The embassy returned with nothing. Still, Herluin may have gathered some valuable intelligence about the disunity within the Turkish camp. After the failure of their diplomatic mission, there was no option left but to fight. At dawn on Monday, June 28th, Bohemond organized the Crusader forces for battle. He divided the army into 6 separate units. The first consisted of the French and Flemish under Hugh of Vermandois and Robert of Flanders. The second was made up of the Lotharingians under Godfrey of Bouillon. The third included the Normans from Normandy under Duke Robert. The fourth group, made up of troops from Toulouse and Provence, was led by the Bishop of Le Puy in place of the ailing Count Raymond. And the final 2 divisions, composed of the Normans from Italy, were commanded by Bohemond and his nephew, Tred. To guard the citadel during the battle, 200 men were left behind in the city under Raymond's direction from his sickbed. While some of the army's priests and chaplains held a service of prayer on the city walls, others marched alongside the soldiers. The historian Raymond of Aguilors was given the honor of carrying the Holy Lance, which had recently been discovered, and was believed to be a sign of divine favor. Each prince carried his own banner into battle, though many knights now wore battered armor and rode poor horses, or even walked on foot, having lost their steeds. Still, the Crusaders were filled with courage and hope as they marched, inspired by recent signs from God. As the Crusaders crossed the fortified bridge out of the city, Kerbogha's Arab commander Wathab ibn Mahmud urged an immediate attack. But Kerbogha hesitated. He believed that if he waited, he could crush the entire Crusader force at once, instead of just the front ranks. However, his troops were restless after the long siege, and the delay was risky. When he finally saw the full might of the Crusader army advancing in formation, he lost his nerve and sent a herald to suggest a truce. But it was too late. The Crusaders ignored the offer and pressed on. Kerbogha used classic Turkish tactics, withdrawing to rougher terrain and then ambushing the Crusaders with a hail of arrows. He also sent a flanking force to attack the Crusaders' exposed left side. But Bohemond anticipated this and had already formed a 7th division, led by Reynold of Toul, to intercept the threat. fierce fighting broke out on the main front. Adhemar of Lepuis's standard-bearer was killed, and the Crusaders suffered losses, but they pushed forward relentlessly. Then, as if to confirm their faith, a vision appeared on a hillside knights dressed in white, waving white banners, said to be led by St. George, St. Mercury, and St. Demetrius. More tangibly, internal divisions in Kerbogha's army now began to destroy it from within. Many of his emirs, fearing that victory would make Kerbogha too powerful, deserted him. The Cock of Damascus was the first to leave, and others soon followed. As panic spread, Kerbogha tried to slow the Crusaders by setting fire to the dry grass in front of his lines, but it was no use. Only Sokman, the Ordikid, and the Emir of Homs remained loyal to him. When they too fled, Kerbogha saw the battle was lost and fled the field. His army collapsed into a full rout. The Crusaders, following St. Andrew's warning not to stop to loot the enemy camp, chased the fleeing troops all the way to the Iron Bridge, killing many along the way. Others tried to hide in the fortress of Tancred but were captured and killed. Those who escaped the Crusaders were often slaughtered by local Syrians and Armenians in the countryside. Kerbogha himself made it back to Mosul with only a small remnant of his army, but his reputation and power were destroyed forever. Ahmed ibn Marwan, commander of the citadel, had watched the battle unfold from his position on the mountain. When he saw that the Turks had been defeated, he sent a herald into the city to announce his surrender. The herald went to Count Raymond's tent, and Raymond promptly sent one of his own banners to be raised over the citadel tower as a sign of victory. But when Ahmed realized the banner did not belong to Bohemond, he refused to accept it. It seems he had already made a secret agreement with Bohemond to be carried out if the Crusaders won. He did not open the gates until Bohemond himself arrived. The garrison was then allowed to leave unharmed, and some members, including Ahmed, converted to Christianity and joined Bohemond's army. The Crusaders' victory was both unexpected and decisive. It ensured that Antioch would remain under Christian control, but it did not settle who among the Christians would rule it. According to the oath taken by all the princes except Raymond, the city should be handed over to the Byzantine emperor. Yet Bohemond had already made clear his intention to keep it for himself, and most of the other leaders were willing to support him. After all, he had masterminded the city's capture and had secured the surrender of the citadel, though they felt somewhat uneasy about breaking their oaths. The other leaders were reluctant to oppose Bohemond. The emperor was far away, had failed to come to their aid, and his representative had abandoned them. The Crusaders had taken Antioch and defeated Kerbogha entirely on their own, holding the city until Alexius might arrive or sending someone in his place seemed both unrealistic and politically dangerous. They also feared alienating Bohemond, who was now their most prominent military leader, Godfrey of Bouillon. For one thought it unwise to stand in the way of Bohemond's ambitions. Raymond, however, remained bitterly opposed to Bohemond. Opposition wasn't just based on personal rivalry. He had formed a positive relationship with Emperor Alexius before leaving Constantinople, and he understood the strategic importance of keeping the emperor's goodwill. Without Byzantine support, it would be difficult to maintain supply lines and defend against future Muslim counterattacks. The unity of the Christian effort would collapse. Adhemar of Aleppo agreed with Raymond. He was committed to working with the Eastern Christians, in line with Pope Urban's intentions, and recognized the political risks of alienating Byzantium. It was likely due to Timir's influence that Hugh of Vermandois was sent to inform Emperor Alexius of the situation at Antioch. Now that the city was secure, Hugh wanted to return home and planned to travel via Constantinople. The Crusaders still believed that Alexius was on his way across Asia Minor. News of his retreat after meeting Stephen of Blois had not yet reached them. Adhemar and Raymond hoped that Hugh's report would spur the emperor to resume his advance toward them. At the same time, the Crusade leaders agreed to remain at Antioch until November, before marching on to Jerusalem. It was a sensible decision. The army was exhausted, and moving forward during the sweltering Syrian summer along unfamiliar, arid routes would be reckless. Moreover, the question of who would ultimately control Antioch still needed to be resolved. Adhemar undoubtedly hoped the emperor would arrive by then to settle the matter. Hugh left in early July accompanied by Baldwin of Hainault. But while traveling through Asia Minor, their group was ambushed and badly beaten by the Turks. Baldwin disappeared during the attack, and his fate remained unknown. Hugh eventually reached Constantinople, but not until autumn. By the time he spoke to the emperor and relayed the full story of Antioch, it was too late in the season to attempt a military campaign across the Anatolian mountains. Alexius would not be able to reach Antioch before the following spring. Meanwhile, tensions within Antioch were rising. Initially, the citadel had been jointly occupied by Bohemond, Raymond, Godfrey, and Robert of Flanders. But Bohemond controlled the most important towers. Now he managed to push out the troops of the other commanders, likely with the approval of Godfrey and Robert. Leaving Raymond's protests ignored, Raymond was furious and, in retaliation, held exclusive control of the fortified bridge and Yagician's palace. However, Raymond was still too ill to take decisive action, and now Adhemar also feels sick. With both leaders of the southern French forces incapacitated, their troops suffered increasing mistreatment, especially at the hands of the Normans. Many of them began hoping that Raymond and Bohemond would reconcile. Bohemond, acting as though he were already the city's ruler, wasted no time asserting his authority. As soon as news of Kerbogha's defeat spread, Genoese merchants rushed to Antioch, eager to claim a stake in its lucrative trade. On July 14th, Bohemond granted them a charter allowing them to establish a market, a church, and 30 houses. From that point on, the Genoese fully supported his claim to Antioch and helped maintain his connection to Italy. They promised to back him up against any challengers, except the Count of Toulouse. If a conflict arose between Bohemond and Raymond, the Genoese declared they would remain neutral, while Raymond and Bohemond continued to eye each other with suspicion. Many of the lesser nobles drifted away, went to join Baldwin in Edessa, while others set off on expeditions to raid for plunder or to establish small fiefs in the surrounding countryside. The most ambitious of these ventures was led by a Lemusang knight from Raymond's army named Raymond Pelet. On the 17th of July, he crossed the Orontes River, heading east, and 3 days later occupied the town of Tel Manas, where the local Syrian population welcomed him. After capturing a nearby Turkish castle, he advanced on the larger town of Merit and Neumann, with an army made up mostly of local Christians. However, these new recruits were untrained and inexperienced in warfare. When Ridwan of Aleppo sent troops to defend the town, the native fighters panicked and fled. Despite this, Ridwan failed to dislodge Raymond Pelet from Tel Manas. Meanwhile, a serious epidemic broke out in Antioch during July. Its exact nature is unknown, but it was likely typhoid, caused by the unsanitary conditions following the recent sieges and battles, and by the Crusaders. Lack of understanding of hygiene in the East, the first major victim was Adhemar of Lepuy, who had been in poor health for some time. He died on the 1st of August. Adhemar's death was one of the greatest losses of the Crusade. Though the chroniclers often portray him as a background figure, their accounts make clear that no one else held such widespread respect and influence. As the Pope's representative, Adhemar commanded authority, but it was his personal qualities that won him the affection of the entire army. He was generous and compassionate, especially toward the poor and sick. Humble and never overbearing, he still offered wise counsel even in military matters. He was a brave and capable strategist of victory at Dorylaeum. It was largely thanks to his planning, and he presided over many of the war councils during the Siege of Antioch. Politically, Adhemar worked to foster cooperation with Eastern Christians, both the Byzantines and the Orthodox churches in Syria. He had been close to Pope Urban and shared the Pope's vision for the Crusade. While Adhemar was alive, he helped temper the Franks' ethnic and religious intolerance and held the selfish ambitions of the princes in check. He never sought to dominate the movement, but he was widely seen as its moral and spiritual leader. As the priest Stephen had said in his vision of Christ, Adhemar was regarded as the true head of the Crusade. After his death, No one remained with enough authority to hold the movement together. The Count of Toulouse, who had once spoken with Pope Urban about crusading policy, did inherit many of Adamar's ideals, but Raymond lacked his skill and could only argue with Bohemond as an equal, not as the voice of the church. In Adamar's absence, none of the princes had the vision or stature to preserve the unity of Christendom. Even those whose ambitions he had challenged never questioned Adamar's honesty, wisdom, or charity. His death was mourned across the entire army, even by Bohemond's followers, and Bohemond himself swore to carry Adamar's body to Jerusalem. The entire crusading host felt his loss deeply, and it cast a shadow over their triumph. There was, however, one man who felt no grief at Adamar's death. Peter Bartholomew had never forgiven the papal legate for doubting his visions. 2 days after Adamar died, Peter took his revenge. He claimed that he had received another vision. This time St. Andrew appeared again, but now accompanied by Adamar himself. According to Peter, Adamar confessed that, because of his disbelief, he had spent the time since his death suffering in hell. He had only been rescued through the prayers of his fellow Crusaders, especially Bohemond, by his small donation to support the upkeep of the Holy Lance. Now forgiven, Adamar supposedly asked that his body remain buried in St. Peter's Cathedral in Antioch. St. Andrew then delivered a message for Count Raymond. Antioch should be given to whoever currently claimed it if he was a righteous man. A Latin patriarch should be appointed to judge his righteousness. The Crusaders were told to repent of their sins and continue their march to Jerusalem, which the saint warned was only 10 days away, but would take 10 years to reach if they didn't return to a godlier way of life. In other words, Peter Bartholomew and his Provençal allies believed that Bohemond should be allowed to keep Antioch so long as he supported the crusade. They also opposed any cooperation with the Byzantines or the local Orthodox Christians. These revelations put Count Raymond in an awkward position. He truly believed in the Holy Lance, and its discovery by his troops gave him significant prestige. While some people credited Bohemond's leadership for the victory over Kerbogha, others attributed it to the power of the lance, which indirectly credited Raymond. But Raymond's other major source of authority was his close connection with Adamar. If the same heavenly messenger who revealed the lance now condemned Adamar and undermined the policy, Raymond had inherited from him one that supported Byzantine claims. Raymond would have to choose between two pillars of his influence. For the moment he chose to delay. He maintained his faith in the lance, but hinted that Peter Bartholomew's newer visions might no longer be trustworthy. Despite St. Andrew's supposed message, Raymond and his supporters still argued that Antioch should be handed over to the emperor. This position put Raymond at odds with much of his army in the wider crusading ranks. Peter Bartholomew's posthumous attack on Adamar caused a backlash. By publicizing the legate's disbelief in lance, Peter reopened the doubts many had felt when the relic was first discovered. The Normans and northern French, who had long disliked the Provençals, began openly questioning the relic's authenticity. They used the scandal to undermine Raymond and discredit his plans. By defending Adamar's reputation, they were also able to attack the very political and spiritual vision that Adamar had championed. Bohemond, can be assumed, was more than pleased with how things were unfolding as the epidemic continued. To spread through Antioch, the leading Crusader princes sought refuge in the surrounding countryside. Bohemond crossed the Amanus Mountains into Cilicia, where he reinforced the garrisons that Tancred had established the previous autumn and received their loyalty. Bohemond intended for his newly claimed Principality of Antioch to include the province of Cilicia. Godfrey went north to the towns of Turbessel and Ravendel, which had been taken by his brother Baldwin and were now handed over to him. Godfrey was envious of Baldwin's growing power, and since all the princes were trying to secure territory near Antioch, he wanted to claim his portion too. He likely agreed to return the towns to Baldwin if the army later resumed its march to Palestine. Raymond's movements during this time are unclear, while Robert of Normandy traveled to Lattakia before the Turkish invasions. Lattakia had been the southernmost port of the Byzantine Empire. The Turks had captured it around 1084, but it later came under the authority of the Arab emir of Khazar. In the autumn of 1097, Ganymer of Boulogne attacked and seized the port, leaving a garrison to hold it through the winter. In March, however, the fleet led by Edgar Atheling, after delivering supplies to the Crusaders at Saint Simeon, sailed on to Lattaquié. Edgar's forces drove out Ganymer's men and took the city in the name of the Byzantine emperor. But Edgar could only leave a small force to defend it, so an appeal was sent to the crusading army for reinforcement. After the defeat of Kerbogha, Robert of Normandy responded to the call and took control of Lattaquié on behalf of the emperor. However, Robert's approach to governing focused entirely on extracting as much money as possible from the local population. His rule quickly became so unpopular that within a few weeks he was forced to withdraw. After his departure, the city was taken over by a new garrison sent by Eustathius Philocaios, the Byzantine governor of Cyprus.